For nearly 700 years, Africans ruled parts of medieval Europe. That single fact alone is rarely taught in Western schools. In 711 AD, a North African army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and founded a civilization in Spain that, at its height, was the most advanced in Europe. They built dazzling cities lit by street lamps, while much of Europe still lived in darkness. They established universities and libraries at a time when literacy was rare in Christian lands. They introduced breakthroughs in science, architecture, medicine, and agriculture that would later help fuel Europe's Renaissance. And yet, their story has been quietly pushed to the margins. This is the story of the Moors, the African Muslims of medieval Europe. And it is also the story of how their legacy was erased. Prepare to witness a chapter of history that upends the myth of an all-white medieval Europe and reveals a richly diverse past hiding in plain sight. Pause for a moment, because once you see this story clearly, European history will never look the same again. Who were the Moors? Moors was the name medieval Europeans gave to the Muslim peoples who conquered and ruled parts of Europe from the 8th to the 15th centuries. The term comes from the Latin Mauri, originally used for the Berbers of ancient Mauritania in northwest Africa, and it literally meant dark-skinned people. Over time, Moor became a broad label. It did not refer to a single race or tribe. In medieval Europe, the word was used for Muslims from Spain and North Africa, and it often implied people of darker complexion. Europeans sometimes tried to distinguish between black Moors and white Moors, but in everyday usage, nearly all Muslims in Spain, whether Arab, Berber, or African, were simply called Moors. This is important because it shows that Moor was not a narrow ethnic category. It was a civilizational identity, shaped by religion, geography, and culture. The ethnic reality of the Moors. Ethnically, the Moors were deeply diverse. The backbone of Moorish society consisted of Berbers, the indigenous Amazigh peoples of North Africa. Alongside them were Arabs from the Middle East, who formed a smaller political and religious elite. There were also sub-Saharan Africans, especially from regions that today include Mauritania, Senegal, and Mali. Over centuries, intermarriage, conversion, and migration produced a mixed society. Arab lineages, Berber tribes, Black Africans, and native Iberians who converted to Islam blended into the population of Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. Contemporary medieval accounts frequently emphasize dark skin when describing Moors. In fact, many European writers use the word Moor almost interchangeably with Black African. As one historian explains, the Moors were not a single ethnicity, but a diffuse group that included Berbers, Arabs, sub-Saharan Africans, and others. Darkness of skin became a common descriptor for Muslim rulers and soldiers in Europe. So when medieval Europeans spoke of the Moors, they were often speaking about Africans ruling European land. That is not modern interpretation. It is how people at the time understood it. African origins of the Moorish world. Geographically, the Moors came from across North and West Africa. The first armies crossed into Spain from Morocco, with fighters drawn from across the Maghreb, including areas that are now Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Many Berber groups also had ancestral ties further south, toward the Sahara. Later ruling dynasties, such as the Almoravids and Almohads, originated from regions near modern-day Mauritania and Senegal, on the southern edge of the desert. These were African empires whose influence stretched from West Africa into Europe. There is also evidence that scholars, administrators, and soldiers from West Africa, including regions connected to the Mali Empire, participated in Moorish courts and intellectual life. Over time, Al-Andalus became part of a two-way exchange linking Islamic Spain, Northwest Africa, and the wider Islamic world, including Egypt and the Middle East. Even today, this African origin lingers in European languages. In Spanish, Moro still refers to people of North African or Muslim origin, often with racial overtones. So to summarize clearly, historically, a Moor was a North African Muslim, frequently dark-skinned. The Moors were primarily Berber Africans, with Arab leadership and strong black African elements. This is not speculation. It is recorded in both Muslim and Christian chronicles of the time. The conquest of Spain, 711 CE. In the year 711, European history took a dramatic turn. A Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad from North Africa led an army of about 7,000 Africans across the narrow waters separating Africa from Europe. They landed at a rocky promontory that would forever bear his name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, known today as Gibraltar. Spain at the time was ruled by the Visigoths, a kingdom weakened by internal conflict and political instability. When Tariq's forces met the Visigothic army at the Battle of Guadalete, the result was shocking. The Visigoths were decisively defeated. One Christian chronicle described the terror of the moment, portraying the Moors as swift horsemen with dark faces and blazing eyes, breaking the Gothic nobility in a single hour. The African Moors had arrived, and Europe was stunned. Why the conquest succeeded? How did such a relatively small force conquer nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula so quickly? Several factors converged. The Visigothic state was deeply divided and unpopular. The Moors, energized by the recent expansion of Islam, encountered surprisingly little resistance in many areas. In fact, some communities welcomed them. Oppressed Jewish populations and disaffected Christian peasants often viewed the Muslim Berbers as liberators. They were promised religious tolerance and lower taxes, a stark contrast to Visigothic rule. Militarily, the Moors were also highly effective. Their fast-moving cavalry outmatched the fragmented Visigothic forces. By 718, the Moors controlled most of Spain and Portugal, an Islamic province they called Al-Andalus. They did not stop there. Moorish forces crossed the Pyrenees into France, capturing Narbonne and advancing as far as Tours. In 732, a Frankish leader, Charles Martel, halted a Moorish raiding force at the Battle of Tours. It was a setback, but not a collapse. The Moors consolidated their rule in southwestern Europe. For the first time in history, a large portion of Europe was under African rule. Building Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus would endure from 711 until 1492. At its height, it covered nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula, with only small Christian enclaves remaining in the north. The Moors established their capital at Córdoba, and from there began to build a civilization that soon outshone anything in Christian Europe. It is crucial to understand this point. The leadership of this conquest was African. Tariq ibn Ziyad himself was a Berber, likely of very dark complexion. Some sources suggest he may have had sub-Saharan African ancestry. Although he served under Musa ibn Nusayr, the Arab governor of North Africa, the bulk of his troops were Berbers, with notable black African contingents. This was not primarily a Middle Eastern invasion. It was, in many respects, an African one. Muslim chroniclers later noted that early rulers of Al-Andalus were mostly Berber, and European art and literature increasingly depicted Moors as black-skinned figures, reflecting how they were perceived at the time. A new civilization in Europe. Within decades, Al-Andalus became a structured Muslim state under the Umayyad dynasty. In 756, Abd al-Rahman I established himself as emir of Córdoba, making the region independent from the Eastern Islamic Empire. Under his successors, Moorish Spain flourished. The conquest was not purely destructive, it was assimilative. The Moors intermarried with local Iberians, converted many to Islam, and incorporated Spain's Roman and Visigothic heritage. Christians and Jews were generally allowed to practice their faith in exchange for a tax, creating a level of religious coexistence largely unknown elsewhere in Europe. By the 9th century, Al-Andalus had become a unique fusion of Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. It was a world where a Berber-speaking grandmother, an Arabic-speaking father, and a Latin-speaking mother could live under the same roof. This was the civilization the Moors built on European soil, and this is only the beginning of the story. Al-Andalus, Europe's most advanced civilization. By the 10th century, Moorish Spain, known as Al-Andalus, had become the most advanced and cultured land in all of Europe. While much of Western Europe struggled through what historians later called the Dark Ages, Al-Andalus flourished as a beacon of light. Its capital, Córdoba, stunned visitors from across the continent. At its height, Córdoba was the largest city in Western Europe, and possibly the largest city in the world at the time. Population estimates range from 350,000 to 500,000 people. To put that into perspective, cities like London and Paris had populations closer to 30,000. This was not just a big city, it was a modern city. Córdoba's streets were paved and illuminated by oil lamps. More than 10 miles of roads were lit at night, something unseen anywhere else in Europe. London would not have street lighting for another 500 years. Travelers wrote with disbelief about Córdoba's 900 public bathhouses. Cleanliness was a social norm. One saying captured the culture perfectly: a poor Moor would go without bread rather than soap. The city had hospitals, palaces, running water systems, sewage management, and organized waste removal. These were comforts medieval Europe could barely imagine, let alone implement. To a European visitor arriving from the north, Córdoba felt like stepping into the future. A civilization built on knowledge education was the true heartbeat of Al-Andalus. At a time when literacy in Christian Europe was extremely rare, Moorish Spain invested heavily in learning. Estimates suggest that as much as 99% of Europe's population was illiterate, including many kings and nobles. In Al-Andalus, education was widespread. Boys from even humble backgrounds could attend free public schools, and many girls received education as well. Literacy was not confined to monasteries. It was woven into everyday urban life. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Al-Andalus had 17 major universities across cities such as Córdoba, Toledo, Seville, Granada, Murcia, and Malaga. These institutions taught medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, philosophy, and engineering. At that same time, the rest of Europe had perhaps two institutions that could loosely be called universities. Córdoba's most famous library, founded by Caliph Al-Hakam II, reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes, all carefully cataloged. Some sources place the number even higher. To understand the scale, Europe's largest Christian libraries at the time held a few hundred books at most. And Córdoba's library was not unique. Al-Andalus had around 70 public libraries spread across its cities. This was Europe's intellectual powerhouse. The Moors did not simply preserve ancient knowledge. They expanded it, challenged it, and institutionalized it. Centuries later, when Europe experienced the Renaissance, much of the foundation had already been laid in Moorish Spain, even if the credit was later reassigned elsewhere. Life in a cosmopolitan society. Urban life under the Moors was sophisticated, diverse, and surprisingly tolerant. Cities were equipped with aqueducts, underground canals, irrigation systems, fountains, and bustling markets stocked with goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Córdoba alone reportedly had thousands of mosques, alongside churches and monasteries. This density reflected both population size and religious plurality. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side. Jewish communities in particular flourished. Jewish scholars became leaders in medicine, philosophy, diplomacy, and science. Figures like Hasdai ibn Shaprat and later Maimonides thrived under Moorish rule. Christians, known as Mozarabs, worked in government, translated texts, and participated in intellectual life. This atmosphere of convivencia, coexistence, created stability and attracted scholars from across the known world. A monk from Switzerland who visited Córdoba around 950 CE described it as the brightest spot on the globe. Not Rome, not Paris, not Constantinople, Muslim Spain. Later historians would openly describe Al-Andalus as a rich African civilization that took shape in Europe. And that description matters. Architecture that redefined Europe. The physical beauty of Moorish Spain matched its intellectual brilliance. The Moors fused Arab, Berber, and Iberian traditions into a distinct architectural style that still defines much of Spain today. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, begun in 784 CE, became one of the most stunning structures ever built in Europe. Its endless rows of red and white horseshoe arches, stacked for height, created an illusion of infinite space. These architectural techniques would later influence European church builders. Palaces like Madinat al-Zahra, a vast royal city near Córdoba, showcased wealth and power on an unprecedented scale. Later, the Alhambra of Granada would emerge as the pinnacle of Moorish architecture. Its courtyards, reflecting pools, carved stucco walls, and geometric tilework created a living vision of paradise on earth. Christian rulers who later conquered these cities were so impressed that they preserved Moorish buildings rather than destroy them. In many cases, they built directly on top of them. The Alcazar of Seville, for example, began as a Moorish fortress. Even after Christian rule, Moorish artisans were hired to continue building in the Mudéjar style, Islamic architecture created for Christian patrons. The influence extended far beyond Spain. Horseshoe arches, ribbed vaults, decorative tilework, and courtyard-centered designs shaped later Gothic and Renaissance architecture across Europe. One historian summarized it bluntly: Córdoba glowed while London and Paris were mud and wood. And that was not exaggeration. Science, medicine, and the foundations of modern Europe. Moorish Spain stood centuries ahead of Christian Europe in science and medicine. The Moors preserved Greek and Roman texts that had vanished elsewhere, works by Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy. But they did more than preserve them. They expanded them. They introduced Arabic numerals and the concept of zero, revolutionizing mathematics. Without this, modern accounting, engineering, and science would be impossible. A Christian monk from Spain, Gerbert of Aurillac, traveled to Moorish lands to study these methods. He later became Pope Sylvester II and introduced Arabic numerals and the abacus to France. In astronomy, Moorish scholars charted stars, refined astrolabes, and produced astronomical tables later used by European explorers. The age of exploration depended heavily on Moorish star charts and navigational tools. In medicine, Moorish hospitals practiced surgery, pharmacology, and hygiene at levels unmatched in Europe. The surgeon Abu al-Qasim of Córdoba wrote a 30-volume medical encyclopedia that became Europe's standard medical reference for centuries. Medical schools in Christian Europe, such as Salerno in Italy, relied heavily on texts translated from Arabic. Europe learned to heal by studying Africa's science. Agriculture that changed Europe forever. Historians often describe Moorish Spain as the site of an agricultural revolution. The Moors introduced rice, citrus fruits, sugarcane, cotton, silk, coffee, eggplant, spinach, artichokes, asparagus, almonds, and pomegranates to Europe. They expanded olive oil production and transformed Iberian agriculture. But more importantly, they introduced advanced irrigation systems. They revived Roman canals, built underground qanats, constructed water wheels, reservoirs, cisterns, and terraced hillsides to make dry land fertile. Some of these irrigation systems still function over 1,000 years later. This increase in food production supported large urban populations and freed people for education, science, and the arts. European agriculture would never be the same. Music, culture, and everyday life. Culturally, the Moors reshaped Europe in subtle but lasting ways. They introduced instruments like the lute and early forms of the guitar. A musician named Zuriat, a dark-skinned polymath, transformed Andalusian court life. He founded one of the world's earliest music conservatories, influenced Spanish music traditions, introduced new clothing styles, seasonal menus, and even table etiquette. European courtly music and troubadour poetry likely drew inspiration from Moorish lyrical traditions. The Moors emphasized hygiene, bathing, deodorant use, and clean living. They introduced structured meals served in courses. They popularized luxury goods like silk, fine leather, glassware, and ceramics. More than 4,000 Arabic words entered the Spanish language, many tied to food, agriculture, government, and daily life. Spanish today still carries the imprint of Moorish civilization in almost every sentence. The big picture. By the year 1000, Moorish Spain was the jewel of Europe. It was Europe's largest city, its scientific center, its cultural heart, and its bridge to the ancient world. This civilization, built on European soil, was fundamentally the achievement of Africans and Arabs. And without Al-Andalus acting as Europe's library, teacher, and innovator, the Renaissance would have looked very different or arrived much later. This was not a footnote in history. It was the foundation. The African presence, evidence of black Moors, setting the record straight. Now we confront the most controversial aspect, the extent of black African presence among the Moors. Detractors often claim the Moors were just Arabs or, at most, tawny Berbers, denying any significant black element. This section presents ironclad evidence from primary sources, DNA analysis, art, and heraldry, that sub-Saharan Africans were indeed present at all levels of Moorish society, from common soldiers to rulers. While not all Moors were black, and nobody is claiming that, the black African contribution was substantial and well documented. And this is where myth meets evidence, primary descriptions. Medieval texts leave little doubt that many Moors were seen as black Africans. We've already seen one 8th century European account comparing the Moors' faces to pitch black tar. There are numerous other examples. A Latin chronicle from 754, the Mozarab Chronicle, describes the Berber troops of the Conquest as Ethiopians, a term medieval Europeans used for black Africans. In the epic Song of Roland, circa 1100 France, the Muslim army is described with some warriors black as melted pitch, reflecting the European perception of Moors as black-skinned. Though poetic, it echoes earlier historical chronicles. The Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, 14th century, wrote about the Almoravid dynasty's origins in southern Mauritania and Senegal, noting they drew from the veiled Sanhaja and other Saharan peoples, which included black-skinned groups. He records that the Almoravid ruler Yusuf ibn Tashfin married a noblewoman of Tekrur, a black West African lineage. Perhaps most telling is an Arab chronicler's description of Yusuf ibn Tashfin himself. He is described as a brown man with woolly hair. Woolly hair is a clear reference to Afro-textured hair, indicating significant black African ancestry or appearance. This description comes from a medieval North African source and refers to the man who ruled Morocco and Spain and defeated King Alfonso VI in 1086. Another ruler, Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, an Almohad caliph of the late 12th century, was called the Black Sultan by Christian chronicles due to his dark complexion. Almohad court records show that several caliphs had African concubines and mothers, resulting in visibly mixed offspring. One Almohad caliph, Al-Mamun, was described by a fellow Muslim as very dark in color. The Berber dynasties that ruled Spain, the Almoravids and Almohads, originated in regions of northwest Africa where black African and Berber populations were deeply intertwined. The Almoravids emerged from the Sanhaja Berbers of Mauritania, just south of Morocco. Modern historians note that given this origin, it is unsurprising that Yusuf ibn Tashfin was dark-skinned and woolly-haired. The Almohads recruited soldiers from as far south as the Niger River region. At the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, 1212, Christian observers recorded seeing units of pitch-black troops within the Almohad army. One medieval legend even claimed the Almohad caliph kept an elite guard of chained black knights, a story likely exaggerated, but revealing how contemporaries perceived the African presence within Moorish forces. The written record is not subtle. Visual and heraldic evidence. Medieval art reinforces what the texts describe. Spanish and French manuscripts regularly depict Moors with jet-black skin, broad noses, and curly hair. In the Cantigas de Santa Maria, commissioned by King Alfonso, the 10th of Castile in the 13th century, Moors are shown in battles as visibly darker than Christian knights. The artists clearly used skin tone intentionally to mark African identity. Church art tells a similar story. The figure of Saint Maurice, a Roman Egyptian martyr, was frequently depicted in medieval Germany as a black African knight in full armor. The famous 13th century statue of Saint Maurice in Magdeburg Cathedral shows unmistakable African features. Scholars widely agree this imagery was influenced by real encounters with black Moorish soldiers and mercenaries in Europe. Heraldry provides perhaps the most striking evidence. Across Europe, dozens of medieval coats of arms feature the Moor's head symbol. The flags of Sardinia and Corsica bear Moorish heads. The medieval arms of Aragon include 4 Moorish kings' heads. Even papal heraldry incorporated the symbol. These were not imaginary figures. They represented real enemies, real allies, and real memories of powerful black Moors. Public festivals in Spain today still reenact battles between Moors and Christians, often portraying Moors with darkened skin, a tradition rooted in historical memory rather than modern invention. Archaeological and genetic evidence. Modern science confirms what chronicles and art already showed. DNA analysis from medieval burial sites in Spain and southern France reveals individuals with North African and Sub-Saharan ancestry. An 11th century Muslim cemetery in Segorbe, Valencia, included a man whose genome was half Iberian and half North African. In Nimes, France, 3 8th century Muslim burials showed North African paternal DNA and African origin maternal DNA, consistent with Berber soldiers. Even today, southern Spanish populations carry measurable North African genetic ancestry, despite the systematic expulsion of Moors after 1492. Skeletal remains from Moorish cemeteries display cranial traits associated with North African and mixed African populations. The science aligns with the sources. Specific personalities, several prominent figures reinforce this picture. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the conqueror, is described in some sources as of African stock. Zuryab, the cultural architect of Córdoba, was famously dark-skinned. Ibn Yasin, founder of the Almoravids, is described as a dark-skinned preacher from the Senegal region. Christian King Alfonso X employed a black Moorish commander, Al-Hajjaj. Marinid Sultan Abu al-Hassan Ali was called King of the Black Army due to his massive black military corps. Black Africans served as soldiers, governors, envoys, cultural leaders, and power brokers across Moorish society. Sub-Saharan Africans were not marginal to Moorish Spain. They were central. They served in armies, governed provinces, shaped culture, and influenced European memory for centuries. The term blackamoor in Renaissance England referred to real people of African appearance from North Africa and Spain, many of whom lived in Tudor England as musicians, servants, and courtiers. The conclusion is unavoidable. To quote modern scholarship plainly, Moors were ethnically diverse and many were black Africans. Denying this means ignoring medieval chronicles, art, heraldry, archaeology, and DNA evidence. The record is settled. Moorish Sicily and southern France. The influence of the Moors was not confined to Iberia. In the 9th century, North African Muslims, mostly from Tunisia and Libya, conquered the island of Sicily, bringing Moorish culture to the central Mediterranean. The Aghlabid dynasty of Ifriqiya, Tunisia, began the invasion in 827 CE, and after decades of fighting, the island was fully under Muslim control by 902. For nearly 250 years, Sicily was an emirate, a sister civilization to Al-Andalus. The Moors made Palermo their capital, renaming it Al-Medina and building it into one of the great cities of Europe. In the 10th century, Palermo had around 200,000 inhabitants and was nicknamed the City of 300 Mosques, rivaling Córdoba and Constantinople in splendor. Under the Caliphate dynasty in the 10th and 11th centuries, Sicily enjoyed a golden age. Agriculture thrived with new crops and irrigation. Sicilians learned citrus cultivation, sugarcane farming, and date palm growing from the Moors, just as Spain did. Palermo became a cosmopolitan port city where Latin, Arabic, Greek, and Berber languages could all be heard. What was unfolding in Sicily mirrored what had already happened in Al-Andalus. The Moorish Emirate of Sicily was multicultural and tolerant, much like Al-Andalus. Muslims, Byzantine Greeks, and Latin Christians coexisted, though Muslims ruled. Sicilian Muslims produced renowned geographers and scientists. One of them, Al-Idrisi, created an advanced world map for King Roger II after the Normans took over, demonstrating the geographic knowledge Moorish Sicily preserved. In 1091, the last Muslim city, Noto, fell to the invading Normans. Yet the Norman rulers of Sicily, such as Roger II and his descendants, embraced Moorish culture rather than dismantling it. They employed Arab and Berber scholars at court, retained Islamic artists and architects, and even kept portions of Islamic law because it worked efficiently. The result was a unique Norman-era Byzantine civilization. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, built in the 1140s under Roger II, features Arabic inscriptions on its ceiling, Byzantine mosaics on its walls, and a blend of Christian and Islamic artistic motifs. King Roger's coronation mantle contains Kufic Arabic embroidery praising Allah, woven by Muslim artisans. Even conquest could not erase Moorish influence. Sicily, under Norman rule, retained its Moorish character for at least a century. Frederick II Hohenstaufen, Holy Roman Emperor in the 13th century, grew up in Sicily, spoke Arabic fluently, employed Muslim archers, and maintained court customs inherited from the Moors. He even created a protected Muslim colony at Lucera in southern Italy that lasted into the 1300s. Arabic words remain embedded in the Sicilian dialect, such as jebbia for cistern and zibibu for raisin. Pasta is sometimes traced to Arab dried noodles known as itriya. The famous cannoli pastry likely descends from Arab sugar and almond traditions. Even after Muslims were expelled or forcibly converted, Sicily's identity remained permanently shaped by its Moorish past. Moorish presence in southern France. In southern France, Moorish influence was brief but significant. Between 718 and 759, the Moors controlled parts of Septimania, modern-day Languedoc. They ruled Narbonne and surrounding towns, calling the city Arbuna. Many local inhabitants preferred Moorish rule to distant Frankish authority, as the Moors allowed religious freedom and sometimes intermarried with local Gothic nobles. This suggests Moorish intentions went beyond raiding. Only in 759 did Pepin the Short retake Narbonne, aided by internal betrayal. Direct Moorish rule north of the Pyrenees ended, but Moorish presence did not vanish. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Moorish groups established a fortified base at Fraxentum in the French Alps. From there, they controlled mountain passes and coastal routes, raiding deep into Europe. In 939, they sacked the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. In 972, they captured Abbot Malleus of Cluny for ransom. These events left deep impressions in medieval French memory. Eventually, regional lords expelled the Moors from Fraxentum by 975. Still, cultural exchange endured. Arabic numerals entered Europe partly through this contact. Charlemagne corresponded with Islamic rulers and received advanced scientific devices from the Muslim world. Occitan poetry absorbed Andalusian forms. Southern French knights traveling during the Crusades passed through Sicily and Spain, absorbing Moorish military tactics and tastes. All of these threads reveal that Moorish influence flowed across the Pyrenees more deeply than often acknowledged. The Reconquista and the fall of Moorish rule, 1000s to 1492. Nothing lasts forever. By the 11th century, internal conflict fractured Al-Andalus into smaller Taifa kingdoms after the collapse of the Caliphate of Córdoba in 1031. These Muslim states often fought each other and paid tribute to Christian rulers. Meanwhile, Christian kingdoms in the north grew stronger. In 1085, Alfonso VI captured Toledo, a major turning point. Alarmed, Muslim rulers invited the Almoravids from Morocco. In 1212, Christian forces united and defeated the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa, breaking Muslim military power in Spain. After this, Moorish cities fell one by one. Córdoba fell in 1236, Valencia in 1238, Seville in 1248. By 1250, only Granada remained. Granada endured for over 2 centuries, flourishing culturally while politically cornered. The Alhambra Palace was built during this final period, but internal strife and the unification of Castile and Aragon sealed its fate. On January 2, 1492, Granada surrendered. Moorish rule in Europe ended after 781 years. What followed was devastating. Promises of tolerance were broken. Jews were expelled in 1492. Muslims were forced to convert or leave in the early 1500s. The Inquisition targeted Moriscos relentlessly. Revolts were crushed. Between 1609 and 1614, hundreds of thousands of Moriscos were expelled from Spain, devastating regions that depended on their skills. Many refugees fled to Morocco, Tunisia, and the Ottoman world, where their expertise was valued. Some retained Spanish language and customs for generations. Spain lost not only a people, but a civilization. Thus ended the chapter of African rule in Europe through exile and erasure. The same year Columbus sailed west, Europe extinguished a part of itself. The irony is profound. The Renaissance was rising, fueled in part by Moorish knowledge, even as the Moors themselves were cast out. Their bodies were expelled, their ideas were not. Historical erasure and whitewashing. If Moorish rule was so influential, why is this chapter so little known or misrepresented in popular history? The answer lies in how history has been written, often by the winners, Christian Europeans, who had motives to minimize or distort the legacy of the Moors. Historical erasure of the Moors took several forms. 1. The Eurocentric narrative. From the Renaissance onwards, European historians crafted a narrative of history that emphasized ancient Greece and Rome, then a Dark Age, and then a rebirth, Renaissance, entirely from European sources. The inconvenient fact that much of the classical knowledge was reintroduced via the Islamic world, and that Europe's most advanced medieval civilization was African-led, did not fit this triumphalist story. So for a long time, textbooks glossed over Al-Andalus or treated it as a mere footnote, or worse, depicted it as a barbarian occupation that produced nothing of importance. The truth, as we have shown, is that medieval Europe's progress was profoundly shaped by Moorish contributions, but admitting that would challenge notions of European superiority. As one commentator put it, world history has told a lopsided tale, centering European exceptionalism while omitting the brilliant contributions of black and brown civilizations. The Moors' legacy was systematically erased or misattributed. During the colonial era, 19th century, European scholars had an even greater incentive to downplay African achievements to justify colonization. Hence, Moorish Spain didn't get its due in mainstream historiography. 2. Religious political bias. After the Reconquista, Spanish chronicles demonized the Moors to justify the conquest as a divine victory. 16th century and 17th century Spanish writers often portrayed the Moorish period as a long dark occupation from which Spain was liberated. They emphasized the battles won by Christian heroes like Santiago Matamoros, the Moor Slayer, a mythical saint who helped in battles. Art commissioned in this period would show Reconquista scenes with heroic white knights and cringing dark-skinned Moors. The positive aspects of Moorish rule, tolerance, learning, etc., were purposefully omitted or credited to something else. Even into the modern era, Spanish national identity was constructed around Catholic unity, leaving little space to celebrate the Islamic phase. 3. Distortion of images. In European visual arts of the 18th and 19th centuries, Moors were sometimes portrayed anachronistically as turbaned Arabs with relatively light skin, or exoticized in Orientalist paintings removed from reality. The fact that many Moors were black Africans was often ignored in art. However, older art closer to the medieval period, like the heraldry and statues we mentioned, still remembered them as black. By the time of early modern Europe, the notion that Africans could build an advanced European civilization was uncomfortable, so histories either omitted detail or cast doubt. For example, some French historians started calling the 8th century invaders Saracens, or just Muslims, to avoid highlighting that they were largely Berbers from Africa. There was even an attempt by some 19th century scholars to claim the Moors were mostly fair-skinned Arabs, and that any high culture they had was imported from the Middle East, downplaying the Berber African role. These claims are not supported by primary evidence, as we have shown, but they persisted in older literature. 4. Loss of records. Some erasure was literal. Libraries and archives of Al-Andalus were destroyed in the turbulence of the Reconquista. For instance, when Christian forces took cities like Toledo or Granada, many Arabic books were burned or scattered. The famous library of Córdoba with hundreds of thousands of volumes was dispersed and likely largely lost during civil wars around 1009 and later Christian capture. So much of the Moorish perspective survived only in bits, copies in North Africa or translations. For centuries, European historians often couldn't read Arabic, so they neglected Arabic sources that told the Moors' story. It's only in the last 150 years that scholars have systematically studied Arabic chronicles of Al-Andalus, which richly detail the civilization. Now, we are recovering what was whitewashed by neglect. 5. Racial prejudices. The term Moor itself underwent a pejoration. By the Renaissance, Moor in Europe often meant any black person. Shakespeare's Othello is called the Moor and is depicted as a black African serving in Venice. This broad usage diluted the specific historical identity of the Moors of Spain. Worse, during Europe's racialist era, some historians couldn't stomach that black or Berber Africans had ruled parts of Europe. So they engaged in what we might call historical negationism, suggesting, for example, that the Moors were mostly white Arabs, not really Africans. We've debunked that with evidence, but those older biases die hard. The result of erasure. The result of these factors is that most people educated in the West get little to no exposure to the true story of the Moors. You might get a paragraph about Muslim Spain was a center of learning, but without emphasis that it was largely African-led and how key it was to Europe's development. Thankfully, in recent decades, scholarship has shifted. Historians like Maria Rosa Menacle, Richard Fletcher, David Levering Lewis, and others have brought renewed attention to Al-Andalus as a model of a multicultural golden age. Menacle's book Ornament of the World highlighted the cooperative spirit and intellectual prowess of Moorish Spain. Academic consensus now recognizes that Moorish Al-Andalus was an integral part of European history, not some foreign enclave. UNESCO and other bodies emphasize the world heritage of places like the Alhambra and Córdoba's Mosque Cathedral, helping educate the public that Europe's past is more complex than previously taught. Why this history matters today. This isn't just about the past, it's about our present understanding of culture and identity. Why does it matter that we acknowledge the African Moors in medieval Europe? First, it shatters the false narrative of a purely white Christian Europe. In a time of rising ethno-nationalism, remembering that Africans were kings and scientists in Europe challenges notions of racial superiority or exclusivity. Europe has always been a tapestry of influences. As one viewer might react, why wasn't I taught this in school? This changes how I see European history. Exactly. It shows Europe's story as not one of isolated development, but of cross-cultural fertilization. Acknowledging the Moors means acknowledging that Islam is part of European heritage, and by extension that Africa is deeply embedded in European heritage. This can foster more inclusive identities in European countries with Muslim or African diasporas by highlighting a shared history. Second, it gives credit where it's due. The achievements of the Renaissance and modern West did not emerge from a vacuum. Knowing that algebra, surgical instruments, or classical texts came via the Moors gives a fuller appreciation of human interconnectedness. It also gives pride to those of African or Maghreb descent, who can point and say, our ancestors contributed fundamentally to Western civilization. This is empowering and helps combat racist narratives that portray Africans or Muslims as having contributed nothing. Facts are a powerful antidote to prejudice. As we've shown, these are documented facts, not a feel-good myth. The more people learn them, the harder it is for bigotry to persist. Third, the story of Al-Andalus carries lessons for today's polarized world. It was not perfect. There were certainly periods of intolerance and conflict. But for long stretches, Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted and thrived together. They demonstrated that civilization is enriched by diversity. In an age where religious and cultural tensions run high, the memory of a pluralistic society that valued knowledge and tolerance is a beacon. It reminds us that there's an alternative to the clash of civilizations. Historically, there was a fusion of civilizations that produced beauty and progress. Additionally, many facets of modern Spanish and European culture are inherited from the Moors, whether people realize it or not. When tourists marvel at the Alhambra or sway to flamenco music, which has Moorish and Gypsy roots, or even relax in a Spanish patio with a fountain, they are enjoying the legacy of the Moors. Recognizing this fosters understanding rather than denial. It says, our cultures have been intertwined for over a millennium, so modern interactions between Europe and the Muslim world are not something new or alien. but a continuation of a long relationship. Finally, there is a justice element. The Moors were written out of history due to racism and religious bias. Telling their story fully is an act of historical justice. It validates the memories kept alive in the marginalized communities. For example, in Morocco and Mali, oral histories long celebrated connections to Al-Andalus. It also honors the spirit of those inquisitive European scholars of the Middle Ages who had the humility to learn from the Moors. For nearly 8 centuries, Africans not only lived in Europe, they ruled parts of it, nurtured it, and left an indelible mark on its civilization. The Moors of Al-Andalus transformed Iberia into a center of learning and culture that lit up the European Dark Ages. They proved that high civilization is not the exclusive domain of any one people. Their story complicates the simplistic narrative of a white Christian Europe by highlighting a time when black and brown Africans were integral to European leadership and innovation. When you walk the old quarter of Córdoba or stand under the arches of its great mosque, you are in a space created by African architects for a multicultural society a millennium ago. The very word Europe owes a debt to that period, for it was under the influence of Moorish science and arts that Europe began to wake from its slumber and eventually forge ahead. We can now see that the Renaissance had parents. One of them was Greek and Roman antiquity, yes, but the other was the Islamic Golden Age carried into Europe by the Moors. As the historian William Durant succinctly put it, Europe was recovering from barbarism, while Islamic culture was at its height. Moorish Spain was the root from which sprang the Renaissance. The saga of the Moors also reminds us that history is not a simple story of one civilization progressing in isolation. It is a story of exchange, conflict, and collaboration. The Moors didn't steal European history, they were European history, just as much as the Franks or the Normans. Their decline and expulsion in 1492 did not erase their accomplishments. Europe remembered subconsciously through the knowledge they left behind, even as it tried to forget who brought it. Today, by recalling the full story, we give credit where it's due and enrich our collective heritage. As the sun sets over the red walls of the Alhambra, and the call to prayer that once echoed there is silent, one might feel a tinge of melancholy for what was lost in 1492, a tolerant society, a fountain of knowledge. But the legacy of the Moors lives on in every university library, every citrus grove in Spain, every algebra textbook, every strumming of a guitar. It lives on in the faces of Spaniards and Portuguese with a glint of North African ancestry, unknown to them. It lives on in the very idea that culture can leap across continents and enrich another. So let us tell the full story. The Moors did build Europe as much as anyone. This hidden chapter, once known, changes our view of the continent's past and its possibilities. It reminds us that from diversity comes strength, that light can come from unexpected places. The Moors didn't just visit Europe, they built a civilization on European soil that helped create the modern world. It's time we all recognize this remarkable truth. If you're fascinated by this hidden chapter of European history and want to explore more stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Visit our homepage to find even more untold stories from across the globe. You can also watch our video on the world in 1324 during Mansa Musa's time. It shows how interconnected the world was even centuries ago, and how African empires shaped global history long before colonialism. Join us as we uncover the past and bring history to life.